and welcome to a very special India Foundation discussion that I'm having with Mr. Walter Russell Mead on a very important topic, something that's on everybody's minds, from thinkers to heads of state. Mr. Walter, thank you so much for speaking to India Foundation. I'm Gaurie Dwivedi, and my question, the first I want to ask you is that you're in India at a time where there's a lot of focus on how far do we want to go ahead on the Quad Road for Indo-Pacific. My question to you, sir, is how does America view the area, the Indo-Pacific as a region, and India's role in the Indo-Pacific?
What we've had now, I think every president from Barack Obama to Joe Biden has said in public that the Indo-Pacific is the center of American foreign policy and national security concern. And that's true from an economics perspective and from a security perspective. So I don't think there's any doubt that this is something, when you have such different politicians from such different parties agreeing on this basic thing, I think we can say for America, the Indo-Pacific really does matter. Then within the Indo-Pacific, there's simply no doubt that because of its population, because of its technological accomplishments, because of its economy, because of its standing in the region, there's really no one like India. And I personally, I spend a lot of time working on American foreign policy, talking to people in the US. I don't know anybody who really disagrees with the idea that the relationship with India is central to the future of American foreign policy.
Irrespective of the multiple noises that come from Washington, some going 2 steps forward, some going 3 steps backward, do you think that hurts the common objective, which is to have this region being free and fair?
Look, the United States and India are both democracies.
Cacophonous.
And cacophony and democracy are closely related. And certainly I could read the Indian press and see lots of comments about the United States and the difficulties of working with the United States. And I know very well there could be an election in India and a different party with a different attitude might form a government. So this is just the way it is when democracies work together. There are, I think, India has in some ways a problem with some of the human rights communities in the United States. And there's a sort of a unique Indian dimension to this, which is that there are some countries where the political right and the human rights groups on the right in the US are very upset, and then others on the left, they're very upset. India has, in a sense, a lot of times in America, the Democrats look at some of the communal questions in India, and they feel a link with the Muslim community in India, and so you get a lot of human rights agitation around that in the Democratic side, and then on the Republican side, sometimes with the Christian communities in India. So you have bipartisan human rights groups. Yes. And then for the politician, if the right says this and the left says this, yes, I don't lose anything by taking this stand. So, and this is a factor in Congress. And we can see, like, even with Israel, we can see that sometimes opposition to things that happen with the Palestinians or whatever, the US the Congress will take a stand, or the president will take a stand. So it doesn't change the fact the US has a relationship with Israel, and Israel is a very important ally. But yes, sometimes these human rights types issues, whether they're right or wrong, do get into the mix. But that, again, I think it's true that in India too, you have political groups that have a very strong opinion about something, and it can affect Indian foreign policy because it affects Indian politics.
And I was going to come to just that when you talk about, and you mentioned this earlier as well, how central identity politics is becoming. Yes. In national discourse, and hence impacting foreign policy.
Right.
How do you see that shaping the foreign policy of India and the region as well? Because there's a lot of churn that is going on in the region itself. There have been elections, there are regime changes that are happening. How do you see that?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about India's region, you look and you see Pakistan, where who knows what's going to be happening there. I think the only thing safe to say is at the end the army will be in charge, the army and the ISI will be in charge. You look at, fortunately, Bangladesh, you see a fairly good situation, but in Myanmar you have a civil war going on. And then you look at Sri Lanka. And in Thailand there's sort of some issues. So we can see, yes, the region is not stable. India, in that sense, I think because it has a flourishing democracy, and for that matter Bangladesh too, has some insurance against these problems because they can be vented in the political system and people can have an election. Yes. In other places that's more difficult. So India, I think, in particular is going through a profound historical stage where for most of the early decades of India's history, the Congress Party was in charge, and it had a certain vision of India. And it projected that vision to the rest of the world as being what India was. But clearly, not everybody in India shared that vision of what India should be. And now with the BJP rising over many years, India has changed, or at least Indian politics have changed. Yes. That creates, and anytime there's change, it affects international relationships too, because everyone got used to one kind of India. Yes. Now we have another kind of India, and we're all curious. What does it mean? Where is it going? This was a big change. Are there more big changes ahead? What will they be? What will be the good consequences and the bad consequences? So, and that inevitably comes into Indian foreign policy too. It comes into the way the press covers India, I think, because many American correspondents, people and diplomats and all knew the old India, and their trusted friends and their sources are connected to the Congress-dominated era. And so when they are politically unhappy with the current state of affairs, their journalist friends in America hear that from well-informed people who have been in charge of many things and who they've known for many years, and on a personal level they trust. So we can see that this change in Indian politics creates all kinds of adjustments are happening around the world around it.
But this assertive national identity comes at a time when you have a very aggressive China. And I say this because as we speak, there have been reports about the Solomon Islands. There have been multiple reports about how China is now going to probably utilize the flux in Sri Lanka to its advantage. Yeah. So at a time like this, when China is the predominant threat in the region, do you think it's important now even the other Quad member nations to be having a more assertive policy and roadmap to deal with China?
I absolutely do. And I thought the last meeting of the Quad, the summit in Tokyo, was a really positive thing. It felt to me as if all four of those leaders were making strong commitments. Everyone seemed to be aware of the danger. Everyone seemed to be concerned. And of course I wasn't surprised, but it was nice to see that even though Australia's had an election and a new government, the new government is coming from the same place on China that the old government
Which is a departure,
yes.
given the previous...
Yes, historically the Labour Party was less hawkish in some ways. But again, China is a very powerful persuader, and it's a great teacher, and China has taught us all many things.
Yes, and then how would you visualize or see this region maybe 2, 3, 4 years down the line? And I ask you this because we are talking just months ahead or Xi Jinping's coronation as president for life. At this stage, it looks set. There's no way to know what's going to happen. But if that were to happen, then this region is probably going to see more intense geopolitical tensions.
I think that's right. I think the big question is really Taiwan, the big worry, because that's for China, that's the most tempting target. And strategically, if China were to succeed in conquering Taiwan, invading and conquering it, not only would that be a terrible thing for the Taiwanese people, but it would mean for Japan that China was essentially able to cut its sea communications with the rest of the world. Yes. And this would be terrible danger for Japan. And I think Japan would have to move toward China, would have to accommodate China in some ways sooner or later if this happened. So what happens in Taiwan is central to the future of the Quad and to this whole region. And an Indian might say, well, Taiwan is really very far away, but you think about
Ladakh, Arunachal. You know, a lot of people in India would say, you know, Taiwan matters, but so does Arunachal, so does Ladakh.
It does. And we have to think about Taiwan everywhere. Again, here's something that I think India needs to think through and come to the United States with a very clear message. How does India want support from the United States on its frontier issues with China? Does India want American troops on the on the frontier? Does it want a treaty so that America is legally obliged to come to India if it's attacked? What is it that India wants? And that's a question only India can answer. So far, I think the American understanding is that India prefers a friendship to a marriage. That non-alignment, there's a deep Indian culture there. There's a concern about how would a treaty relationship bind India. I'm not suggesting this, by the way. I don't have a view.
You're raising the questions, yes, which in fact are being raised in India as well. That if we are to be completely non-aligned, then how do we count our friends and enemies? Right. How do we count our supporters? And if we want to be aligned, then how do we want our position to be in the world? Exactly. Because, you know, we are if not a global pivot, we are a regional pivot on our own. Then that gets compromised if we become an alliance partner or a treaty partner. So those are tough questions.
It is a tough, although I look at some of the European countries, I mean, Germany and France are in NATO, but Germany and France have a lot of freedom of action. You know, an alliance with the United States is not the same as an alliance with China, in that sense, or Russia. But I do think the question, whether I don't, again, I'm not trying to sell a treaty of alliance. I don't have a view. And a lot of people in America said, what, American troops in the Himalayas? What are you talking about? So it would be controversial in the U.S. as well. But it's clear that both India and the United States need to think hard about where we stand with China and what each of us needs from the other and what each of us can offer to the other. And I think we are in both countries, people are looking at this much more deeply. I think probably the war in Ukraine is having an impact too, because Ukraine is a country that didn't have treaty allies.
In fact, I was going to come to just that one may think that how much is the Indo-Pacific related, but just how much is Ukraine impacting the world equations right now is astonishing. And many would say, and analysts have been saying that, you know, look how Ukraine has been given everything except for troops on ground. And it has been able to sort of, you know, fend against the Russian troops. And that could be some sort of a lesson for China that, you know, Taiwan is not going to be the simple scoot in and, you know, you can invade. Do you see the similarities there, or do you think we are just, you know, trying to do a copy paste of a completely different model?
Well, they are different, you know, they're different situations. You know, let's say first that Russia currently has occupied 20% of Ukraine's territory. And I don't think...
And cut off the ceilings.
Yes, with huge consequences for people who like to eat. So, and they are, as we speak, as you know, the military news is constantly changing, but the last few days, Russia seems to have the momentum. So, and it was interesting that Finland and Sweden seem to have decided that they would like to join NATO, having seen what happens if you're not in NATO. So it really depends on the nature of the threat and where you stand with regard to it. I mean, part of the difficulty for India is that these territories, where China has claims, are so remote and so hard to access. These are, I mean, Russia was able to attack Kyiv in the first few hours of the war. China couldn't quite attack Delhi in that way, so that the cases are not exactly comparable.
Also, Ukraine and India are not comparable, but
right.
But then on the issue of Ukraine, I want to ask you this: that in the initial few weeks, even now, in fact, till about a few weeks back, many people in DC and so many analysts in Europe were very puzzled is a mild word, but were deeply, quote unquote, disappointed by India's position on Russia, which is nuanced for many reasons, for historical reasons, for military reasons, and of course for non-alignment reasons as well. Do you think that position has now been accepted, has been embraced, and has been well understood?
I would say well understood. I'm not sure embraced would be too strong of a word. I think
the reason why I said embrace is because then you can keep that in mind for future right. discussions, and because this is an evolving situation, and Russia even 1 year down the line will see some sort
right.
of
you see, I think again there's, in the American context anyway, there was a sense during the Cold War that India tended to be more forgiving of Soviet behavior than of American behavior. So the invasions of Hungary and Czechoslovakia, India did not seem to feel a problem, or that non-alignment was, Americans seemed to feel it was more non-alignment against America more than non-alignment equally about both. Now that might not, I'm not enough, I haven't studied the period, I'm not going to come to a judgment there, but that's a perception, a pre-existing perception in American foreign policy, that this is the sort of thing India does. On the one hand, you're less surprised when they do it, but on the other, people do wish it would somehow find a way to take a stronger stand.
And just on the side, the perception has also been built because of, maybe as a consequence or due to some other factors, America-Pakistan relations have also been, during the 60s, 70s, 80s, they were very, very good. And that also had an impact on how India had to respond.
Of course it did.
So, yes.
But I don't think there are many people in India who think now that U.S.-Pakistan relations are particularly good.
Yeah, I think that is behind. Yeah. But then I'm going to ask you two last questions on trade. You mentioned that, and that's a subject that's close to my heart as well. And I ask you this because there hasn't been enough discussion, many feel, and I feel, about just how much China has been given a free ride. And there is still many quarters in business community who feel that, you can't, take back some of those concessions because it impacts everybody. We are part of this one big global interconnected economy, and we all stand to benefit from a cheaper destination. Do you share that view? And how optimistic are you that the ruptures that have been made in the global supply chain will benefit countries like India, America permanently?
Well, it's clear that among other things, both the pandemic and the war in Ukraine have taught a lot of people the lesson that you need to think about your supply chain. You can't just take it for granted that at the moment you need something, it's going to be right there. And if you need two of them, they'll be right there. And so so this is not about statecraft or security policy. It's just simply, if you want to run a company and you want to be able to sell cars, you need to make sure that politics is not going to interfere with your ability to do that. Well, so what do? You look for places to invest where you don't see political problems, and you also want to have more than one place, one factory in one country. You want to diversify. So in that sense, I do think that lots of people now understand that they need to diversify their supply chain. And this would not just be America. I think Japan has realized we have, in some cases, a 90% exposure to China. And here are these people marching around going, death to Japan, death to Japan. So they are looking. And for Japan, Vietnam is the most obvious close destination. Philippines maybe, Indonesia. But India would, you think about a Japanese company that likes to sell in Europe. India is a very, very natural destination. So this is not simply about the bilateral US-India, and it's also not simply about governments telling people what to do and what not to do. This is common sense business. And I do think it's interesting to me that India seems to be working on, it has already done great work, I think, on beginning to improve its infrastructure to make it easier for manufacturers to be here. I think some labor law reforms, there's been a lot of discussion of how to maybe allow different states to develop their labor codes so that they can take advantage of opportunities. And those strike me as opening the door to India having more manufacturing. And I also believe that building up the manufacturing economy is really important for India for poverty reduction and social justice. Because tech is wonderful, but it tends to favor people who are extremely well educated and often fluent in English to be ready for that global market. And not everybody in India has those advantages. Manufacturing is something you can do with a basic education from a village. You can do this. And so while tech has been the avenue for some Indians to reach global levels of freedom and affluence and all these wonderful things, for a lot of Indians, manufacturing really matters.
Yes, and it should, because we need labor intensive as well, technology, and we need those factories going. And on that note, last question I have to ask you this is, news that comes out of the world's second largest economy impacts everybody. And the economic parameters right now are not positive for China. Do you see that as a blip because of the multiple lockdowns? There were about 340 million people in lockdowns, 45 odd cities. Or do you see that probably slowing down and a slightly long-term trend that the world needs to adjust to?
Well, I do think, trees don't grow to the sky, even in China. People, China is not going to grow at 8 to 10% a year forever, especially if its economy depends on exports. Because if you're growing at 10% and your market is growing at 3%, this can't last. So there is a built-in obsolescence to the Chinese model. Also, clearly, they have China has the most massive economic bubbles we've seen in the history of the world. The real estate bubble. You drive through a city in China and you'll see these 17-story apartment buildings off almost to the horizon. No one living in any of them. And the country's population is not growing. The country's population is actually beginning to decline. So, and then you think about all the banks that made the loans to those buildings, all the cities that have borrowed money to create the infrastructure that supports those buildings. A lot of China's wealth is paper wealth. And we don't know. Now, the one thing we do know is that the Chinese Communist Party is going to do everything in its power to keep those bubbles inflated. And they know they can't do this forever. And every now and then they come back over and over. They say, we must reform, we must change this, and we're going to tighten up the housing market, and we're going to stop wasting money on infrastructure projects. We're going to rein in local government. They start doing all those things. The stock market goes down, the growth rate goes down. We can't do it, we can't do it. And so they go back to pumping everything up. And they've been trapped in that cycle for a long time. Now, I don't know how this ends. What is happening in China has never happened before on this scale. So the person who tells you that they know what's going to happen next in China is either a prophet or an idiot. And there are more idiots than there are prophets.
On that note, it's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for taking out the time. And thank you to our viewers for watching this very special India Foundation discussion.